Hi guys, Roland here from Top Watch. Today we're shooting in the South African Naval History Museum and we're going to be talking all about divers' watches and the effect that the military and the diving industry has had on this amazing class of watch that we call the sports watch today. We have a great interview lined up with an ex-South African recce diver who also happens to be my dad and the guy who got me into watches. Stick around, I'm sure you're really going to enjoy this one. So without further ado, joining us from the Sunshine Coast in Australia over Zoom today because we do have coronavirus restrictions in place, making travel a little tough. David, Dad, welcome.
Hey, Rolly, thank you. Good to see you.
Awesome. Nice to have you on board. So we're talking today about dive watches and in particular, I should say, military dive watches. So for those who don't know, would you mind just giving us a little bit of a background and a history on the role that you played in what was then called the South African National Defence Force?
Yeah, I joined the Reconnaissance regiment at some stage, and it's a diving unit in the army. At that stage, the Special Forces had its own corps, or was about to get its own corps. But anyway, it was an army unit, and we were seaborne orientated unit, and therefore diving, attack diving, and underwater demolitions was part of our tasks. And naturally, we had a watch, and everything was issued, except your wife that we had to choose our own. But everything else. Anyway, we used our first watches were the Seiko was diver's watch, the little with the red and blue bezel, red and black bezel. Can't quite remember. But a wonderful watch, kept time. It's a quartz watch, easy to see. But it had its limitations in that we dive at night and very dirty, murky water, and of course at night. So we would like to see one that wouldn't affect our compass, although it was always like 5 degrees left.
Magnetism of the watch would actually pull your compass off a little bit.
Yeah, but it would pull it off always, if it was 2 degrees to the left. And it's always 2 degrees, and you just bear that in mind. So if you're working out your bearing, you'll add or subtract your difference for the magnet. So it wasn't a major train smash. It was good enough, and it was real hard wearing, nice silicone strap. And but there was at that stage a Casio had brought out a watch that was, you could have like timekeeping. So you work out distance, etc., to try and get to your targets and your different RV points or so on under the water, and you needed to keep a certain time that you work out more or less you're swimming at the speed or whatever current, etc., and you try and RV there at that point. But this watch had a stopwatch to the Casio, and it had like a bright red luminous letters or figures that come out. Yeah, and it was mainly plastic, and that we thought, this would be great, And at some stage, some meeting, we put out the request that we could have a more luminous timekeeping watch, etc., and one that doesn't affect the compass. Yeah, so that we could just work out your bedding and go. But anyway, a couple of weeks later, there arrived this box of Rolex Oyster Submariners, which everybody just laughed.
That sounds like a government official if I've ever heard. Requesting some cash.
Yeah, they were looking after us really well. And at first, given only to the divers and some of the officers, etc. And then later on, most operators would get this as an issue when they come to the unit. Yeah, a wonderful watch, naturally. And it didn't, the alloy that it's made of didn't affect, it's not steel or some sort of, anyway, it didn't affect the compass. A beautiful watch, of course. And we kept that until you left. And then when you leave, of course, you hand it back. And a lot of people did think what the Seiko never happened was that we never lost it in the surf. But the Rolex is somehow, the guys would, they would lose them in the surf. I think it must have been something to do with the strap, I suppose.
No. That double folding safety security strap in metal with a strong system sounds susceptible to being lost in the surf. I can see how you've been missing it. Yeah.
I never lost mine in the surf. I gave it back and I asked them if I could buy it. By the time they answered me 2-3 months later, I couldn't afford it. So I turned the offer down, and it was fairly cheap.
Do you recall what price it was?
Yeah, when I offered to buy it, they offered it to me at 2,300 Rand. Of course, they the army would have gotten it in tax-free. Not that there is any taxes now, I think, on watches, but maybe then there was. And of course, buying a whole box from someone loaded with Rolex oysters, they must have had, I don't know where they got these things from, but anyway, that was more or less the price. I think the price then, we're talking 1982, 83 when they were issued, and the same watches. Then when I left in 93, towards the end of 93, that I couldn't afford it, so I turned it down. And I believe now they are quite
you're
pricey.
As my dad, you're obviously a mentor, and in every sense, how I was brought up and what I do today, and financially as well. And I just want to highlight there's a few points there I want to go back to on your story. But firstly, that 2003 or 600 Rand you just mentioned, the watch in question, because I've done a little bit of research before we started here, was a 5513 military spec Submariner. A few of those watches, I've done a little bit of Googling, have ended up on second-hand watch websites, quite proudly displayed as South African military issue. I suppose, somebody must have found them walking on a beach somewhere. I don't imagine an old soldier would have kept his and sold it on. But the going rate there today is in the region, a little bit north of 200,000 Rand per piece. So
wow.
Wouldn't have been a bad investment to keep it all. Yeah.
I'd say.
I think the reason the military would have chosen that piece for you is obviously because of Rolex's famous oyster case, that crib lock sealing system on their crowns, absolutely fantastic, that nice domed bezel. At that stage, they were still using tritium, radioactive material on the dials for the luminosity, which doesn't need to be agitated by light. It shines up really nicely. I can see why they made that choice. And it sort of, it brings up a few interesting things to me. Firstly, Rolex as an investment, that's just absolutely unbeatable. These things just escalate. Secondly, the reason I love watches, because I'm not into the investment side of it, I always look for value in a watch or just for a product that I'm passionate about. The story behind a watch can be so exciting. And the story behind this watch or these watches, to me, is just absolutely epic. For those who don't know, the unit you were involved with there, 4th Reconnaissance, I'd liken them to what was the SBS, the Special Boat Services for the Brits before it became the SAS, Navy SEALs in the US term, SAS for the Australians and the New Zealanders. So we've got the investment aspect, we've got a great story behind it. It's the fact that the military has been an innovator in so many senses. So many of the things we use now, speaking of a Skype and the internet, only exists because of military limitations and communications, and that's why the internet's come about. And war, as terrible as it is, has driven so many of the inventions and technologies that we use in our day-to-day lives today. So that would be point number 3 for me. And the last point number 4, is whenever you're offered a Rolex, buy it at the price it's offered at, because it's only going to cost you more tomorrow.
Yeah, it's always a could have, would have, should have,
Absolutely. And we've seen it. I mean, there's a couple of other brands. I think the French officers were all issued Blancpain 50 Fathoms. The Italian military during World War I or World War II, apologies, the birth of the Panerai brand came from their demand for watches as well. And there are a number of other brands that have associated themselves with military divers. And then, of course, the fact that it's a tool watch. These watches were built for a purpose and for a function. And I see it with my client base today. The guys are absolutely beside themselves when they've scratched their Rolex. We see some guys coming in, just almost tears running down their eyes because of the smallest mark on the clasp. And to me, a watch is what you guys use them for. It's a tool. It's a daily companion. It's something you beat up and you're proud of it when you do. It's doing its job and what it's designed to be done. So our Rolex fans out there, guys, wear those watches, use them, enjoy them. Don't worry about a scratch, please. These are some of the most robust things in the world. The engineering behind them is fantastic. And they all enjoy them. Sad to see them.
That sapphire crystal glass was a huge bonus over the Seiko, And that's what you want. You want to see clearly, exactly. Yeah. And it stayed like that, the glass and the face, you could always see. Of course, the strap and the bezel and that, you get a few knocks, but that never stopped from giving you the accurate time or giving you a very clear picture of the time in any way. That's good.
Yeah. So there we have it, guys. Whether it's the Blancpain 50 Fathom, the Rolex Submariner, the Tudor Mill Sub, or the Panerai Radomir series, it went from their wetsuits to the suit cuff on your wrist. Thanks for joining us today. Give us a like and subscribe, and we look forward to hosting you on the next one.